It was a Friday evening, the kind of night Daniel looked forward to all week. The living room of their house was warm and alive, filled with the sound of clinking glasses and bursts of laughter. His close friends were scattered around the sofa and armchairs, talking loudly over one another as the smell of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread drifted from the kitchen. The table was set with care, candles flickering gently, every plate neatly placed, and the food arranged with love. Aisha had spent hours preparing everything, making sure nothing looked out of place. She had chopped, stirred, baked, and seasoned, her hands never stopping from the afternoon till now. She wanted the night to go well, not for herself, but because she knew how much it mattered to Daniel to impress his friends. As she carried out a tray of drinks, her smile was soft and polite, though her body already ached from the long day. She handed each glass carefully, making sure no one felt left out. Daniel accepted his with a grin, pulling her closer for a moment before turning away and throwing his arm around his best friend's shoulder. "You see, my wife's good for something," he said with a laugh, holding his drink high. The word stung Aisha instantly, but she swallowed the feeling, forcing herself to laugh along. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that. She told herself it was just a careless joke, that he didn't mean it, but deep inside, something twisted in her chest. The conversation rolled on, and Daniel's confidence grew with every sip of his drink. His friends teased each other about work, about sports, about the latest gossip from the neighborhood. Then, almost naturally, Daniel's focus turned to Aisha again. "You know," he said loudly, "she takes forever in the kitchen. If dinner comes out tonight, it'll be a miracle." His friends laughed politely, though one of them shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Aisha with pity. She lowered her eyes, pretending to adjust a tray in her hand, her cheeks burning. She wanted to disappear into the kitchen, to hide where no one could see the shame rising inside her. But Daniel wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, his voice filling the room as if he wanted the world to hear. "She once told me she wanted to start her own business," he said, chuckling. "Can you imagine? She can barely handle boiling pasta without calling me for help, and she thinks she can run a company." His laughter was sharp, and it spread around the room, though not everyone joined in fully. Some of his friends looked at each other, unsure if they should encourage him or stop him. But Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the sound of his own voice, too busy proving himself at the expense of the woman standing right beside him. Aisha stood frozen for a moment, the tray heavy in her hands. That dream he had just mocked, the little business she had once whispered him about on a quiet night when she felt safe, it wasn't something she shared with anyone else. She had told him because she trusted him. She had pictured his encouragement, maybe even his help. But instead, he had turned it into a weapon, a joke to throw in front of others. Her chest felt tight, and her eyes stung with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of the men who were watching her, waiting to see how she would react. She set the tray down calmly, her fingers trembling slightly, and forced herself to take a slow breath. The evening continued like a cruel performance. Daniel told story after story, each one with her as the punchline. He laughed about how she once burned toast, how she once got lost driving to a new place, how she sometimes mispronounced English words. None of these things were worth mocking, but the way he told them made her sound like a fool. Every laugh from the men around the room was another cut, another reminder that she was standing alone in the middle of a crowd. She smiled weakly when they looked at her, pretending she didn't care, pretending it was fine. But inside, her heart felt heavier with each passing second. At one point, one of Daniel's friends, a man named Imran, tried to lighten the mood differently. "Come on, Daniel," he said gently. "She's the one who made this amazing food tonight. Give her some credit." Daniel waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, please. Anyone can follow a recipe. That doesn't make her special." He grinned again, clearly enjoying the attention, clearly blind to the way his wife's spirit was quietly breaking. Aisha turned away to refill the snack bowls, but her hands shook so badly that a few peanuts spilled onto the table. She quickly scooped them up, hoping no one noticed, though she could feel Daniel's mocking eyes following her every move. As the night stretched on, Aisha moved between the kitchen and living room like a shadow. She brought food, cleared plates, and forced herself to keep a calm expression. She laughed at jokes that hurt her, smiled when she wanted to cry, and nodded when her husband spoke as if his words didn't matter. But inside, something was shifting. The pain that usually made her retreat into silence began to harden into something else. She didn't know what it was yet, only that she couldn't forget the way he had humiliated her in front of people who were supposed to be their friends. She couldn't forget the sound of their laughter echoing around her, as if her feelings were nothing but entertainment. By the time the night was over and the guests began to leave, Aisha stood quietly by the door, thanking them for coming. Her smile was soft, her voice steady, but her eyes held a sadness that no one dared to mention. Daniel slapped his friends on the back, boasting about the evening as if it had been a success. He didn't notice the silence in her tone, the way she avoided his gaze, or the storm slowly building inside her. As she closed the door behind the last guest and turned back into quiet house, she felt something awaken in her, a decision she wasn't ready to name, but knew she would not forget. Tonight, he had crossed a line, and though she said nothing, her silence was not weakness. It was the beginning of something he would never see coming. The night dragged on longer than Aisha expected, and though the laughter faded as the friends said their goodbyes, the echoes of Daniel's cruel jokes lingered in her mind like shadows that refused to leave. When the house finally grew quiet, she stood alone in the kitchen, her hands immersed in the soapy water as she washed each dish with slow, deliberate movements. The smell of food still clung to the air, mixed with the faint scent of alcohol from the glasses Daniel had left behind. She could hear him in the living room, laughing at something on television, completely unaware of the storm raging silently inside her. The humiliation she had endured only hours earlier replayed again and again in her mind. The mocking tone in his voice, the way his friends had laughed along, the dismissive flick of his hand when someone tried to defend her. Every detail burned into her memory, but instead of letting the pain break her spirit, it began to take another shape. She felt anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, a controlled fire that was not loud or reckless, but steady and strong. She paused, staring at her reflection in the kitchen window, where the darkness outside turned the glass into a mirror. For the first time, she saw herself not as a quiet wife who tolerated his disrespect, but as a woman who had been pushed too far. She could see the redness in her eyes, the tightness in her lips, but beyond that, she saw a flicker of something else, a kind of determination that she had buried for too long. It struck her then that silence had been her armor, but silence could also be her weapon. She had given Daniel the power to speak over her, to laugh at her expense, and to treat her like she was invisible. Tonight had shown her exactly how much he underestimated her, and the realization brought with it a strange sense of strength. When she finally finished cleaning, she walked into the living room where Daniel had fallen half asleep on the couch, a faint smile still playing on his lips as though the evening had been nothing more than harmless fun. He barely looked at her when she passed, muttering a casual, "Don't forget to turn off the lights before you come to bed." It was a kind of careless command he often gave, as though she were just another part of the house that existed to keep everything running. Aisha did not respond. She simply nodded, but inside, her thoughts were sharper than they had ever been before. She knew as she confronted him directly now, it would only lead to arguments he would dismiss with his usual arrogance. Words would not be enough. What she needed was action, something that would leave him stunned, something he could never laugh away in front of his friends. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, staring up at the ceiling while his steady breathing filled the silence, she began to think about what she wanted for herself. For so long, her world had revolved around Daniel's moods, his demands, and his careless words. She had put her own dreams aside because she thought supporting him, keeping the peace, and playing the role of the dutiful wife would earn his respect and love. But now, she understood that nothing she did would ever be enough for him. The more she gave, the more he took, and the less he valued her. He had not just crossed a line tonight. He had erased it completely, leaving her with a choice. She could continue to live in the shadow of his pride, or she could rise and carve her own path, one that did not depend on his approval. As the days passed after that evening, Aisha's silence grew heavier, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was a silence of preparation. She began to move differently, with a quiet focus that Daniel failed to notice. While he continued his routine, bragging to his friends on the phone, going to work, and returning home with the same careless attitude. She was planning something entirely new. She made small phone calls when he was not around, reaching out to her cousin who ran a small printing business, asking about suppliers, about design, about how to take the first steps in creating something of her own. She contacted an old mentor from her college days, someone who had once encouraged her creativity, and asked for guidance. Each conversation was like a piece of the puzzle falling into place, each step reminding her that she was more capable than Daniel had ever allowed her to believe. Her heart still ached when she remembered the laughter that night, but she transformed the ache into energy. She worked late into the evenings, pretending to be busy with house chores while secretly writing down ideas, sketching plans, and researching how to launch a dream. She had once imagined herself running a small business, something Daniel had mocked so cruelly. And now, the idea became more than a dream. It became her mission. The more she invested her time into it, the less Daniel's words haunted her. For every insult he had thrown, she built a stronger foundation for her vision. The shame he had tried to place on her was no longer hers to carry. What Daniel did not realize was that his cruel jokes had given her the very push she needed. In trying to break her spirit, he had unlocked a part of her that refused to stay small. Aisha no longer looked at herself as the woman in the background of the stories. She began to see herself as the author of her own. And though she said nothing to him in those quiet days, though she smiled when he dismissed her and nodded when he ignored her, inside, she was preparing for something he would never expect. She didn't want revenge through words or arguments. She wanted something far greater. She wanted to stand in front of him, in front of the very friends who had laughed at her, and show them all the strength of the woman he thought he could mock without consequence. The night he had humiliated her still lived in her memory, but instead of breaking her, it had become the seed of her transformation. The woman who had once stood silently in the kitchen, swallowing her tears, was slowly turning into someone who would no longer be overlooked. And though Daniel remained blind to the change, caught up his arrogance, Aisha knew in her heart that her time was coming. The storm he had unknowingly created was gathering strength, and when it broke, it would not be loud or violent. It would be calm, graceful, and unforgettable. Everything he never thought she could be. The next morning came quietly, the sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and casting a pale glow across the bedroom. Daniel stirred lazily, stretching as if the world owed him another day of comfort. He yawned, rubbed his eyes, and reached out for the newspaper that lay on the bedside table, not even glancing at Aisha, who had been awake long before him. She had risen early, as she always did, moving silently through the house, making breakfast, preparing tea, and tidying up the living room that still carried the faint smell of the party. Her movements were calm, but her mind was far from still. Every sound of laughter from the night before was etched in her memory, and every mocking word from Daniel was replayed in her head, as if it were a lesson she could not afford to forget. When Daniel finally made his way to the table, he sat down heavily, picked up the cup of tea she had placed there, and sipped without gratitude. "You know, last night was good," he said casually, folding the newspaper open. "The guys had fun. You should have seen their faces when I told that story about you and your big business dream. They couldn't stop laughing." His chuckle filled the air, thick and careless. He didn't notice the way Aisha's hand froze for a moment as she placed the plate on the table. She quickly regained her composure, arranging the dishes neatly, her face calm, her silence steady. Inside, though, something in her hardened further. His words no longer cut the way they had the night before. Instead, they fueled the determination that had quietly taken root in her heart. Daniel was a man who believed silence meant weakness, who thought a lack of response was surrender. He had grown used to Aisha lowering her eyes, hiding her tears, and pretending not to care when he spoke carelessly. He never realized that silence could mean something else, that it could mean planning, that it could mean patience, that it could mean waiting for the right time to act. Aisha's silence that morning was not the silence of a broken woman. It was the silence of someone who had already decided her path, someone who was too busy building her future to waste words on arguments that would lead nowhere. After breakfast, Daniel left for work with his usual swagger, tossing his car keys into the air and whistling as he walked out. The door closed behind him, and the house fell into a peaceful stillness. Aisha sat at the table for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the untouched food in front of her. Then she took a deep breath, stood up, and went to fetch the small notebook she had hidden in the cupboard. She opened it and began writing. It was not just random notes. It was a plan, step by step, carefully laid out. She wrote about what she wanted to create, the kind of business she dreamed of, and the people she needed to reach out to. Each word on the page felt like a brick in the foundation of the new life she was quietly constructing for herself. She picked up the phone and dialed her cousin's number, her voice low but steady. "I need your help," she said simply. Her cousin listened as she explained her idea, offering guidance and connections to suppliers. Later, she called her old mentor, who was delighted to hear from her after so many years. They spoke for nearly an hour, discussing strategies, online platforms, and how to build an identity from scratch. With each conversation, Aisha felt her confidence grow, her vision clearer. She was no longer the woman who doubted herself because her husband dismissed her dreams. She was a woman who was learning to believe in her own strength, her own voice, her own power. The days that followed became a rhythm of quiet transformation. During the daylight hours, she carried out her usual duties: cooking, cleaning, maintaining the home, her expression calm, her movement steady, giving Daniel no reason to suspect anything had changed. But in the evenings, when he grew distracted with television or drifted off to sleep on the couch, she worked quietly on her notebook, on her laptop, on phone calls that shaped the skeleton of her dream. She researched suppliers, studied designs, and sketched logos. She asked questions and wrote down every answer, like a student hungry for knowledge. She was building something piece by piece, and though it was still fragile, she knew it was only a matter of time before it grew strong enough to stand on its own. Daniel remained blind to it all, too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the subtle shift in his wife. He still made jokes when his friends called, still laughed at the stories he had already told a dozen times, still believed that Aisha's silence meant nothing more than obedience. He had no idea that each careless word was shaping her into someone he would no longer recognize. He had no idea that the woman he thought would remain small was already preparing to stand taller than him in ways he could never imagine. One evening, as she folded laundry, Aisha overheard him on the phone with one of his friends. He was laughing again, his voice loud and careless. "You know my wife? She still hasn't given up that silly dream. She actually tried asking about business again last week. Can you believe it? She should stick to the kitchen." The laughter on the other end of the line blended with his own, and for a moment, Aisha's hands paused on the shirt she was folding. But instead of pain, she felt a calm smile spread across her face. He thought he knew her. He thought he had won. He thought she was still the same woman who swallowed her tears and stayed silent in the face of his cruelty. He could not see that she had already crossed into a new chapter, that her silence no longer belonged to him. When she looked at him that night, sprawled on the couch with the phone pressed to his ear, bragging as though he had everything under control, she saw not the man who had mocked her, but the man who had unknowingly given her the fire to rise. She said nothing, kept her head down, and continued folding the laundry. But in her heart, she knew the day was coming when the truth would no longer be hidden. Her response was not ready yet, but it was growing. And when it finally revealed itself, it would not only silence his laughter, but leave an unforgettable mark on everyone who had once laughed at her pain. Daniel's arrogance did not fade with time. If anything, it settled into the house like a stubborn smell, familiar and ignored by the man who carried it. He moved through his days with the same careless rhythm, making calls, sharing jokes, returning home with the swagger of someone who believed his place in the world was secure. Aisha watched him without bitterness, the way one watches weather. Unpleasant, sometimes harsh, but not in charge of the seasons within. While he boasted that she was too soft to handle anything difficult, she was quietly training her patience to hold more weight than his pride could ever lift. She no longer let his words pierce her the way they once did. Now they slid past her like dull stones, falling where she no longer stood. And in the quiet corners of the day, she built something he could not see, because he did not know how to look for it. Her cousin became a lifeline, not just with suppliers and printing contacts, but with a steady reminder that every idea could be shaped into something real if she kept showing up for it. They spoke in the afternoons. When Daniel was at work, about sample materials, packaging that felt personal, and pricing that would not scare away first-time customers. The cousin taught her small things that mattered: how to write a clear message, how to present a product with warmth, how to ship something with care so it arrived like a promise kept. Aisha took notes until her wrist ached, then typed them into her laptop so she could see the plan unfold in front of her like a map. She experimented with colors and fonts for a brand that still had no face in the world. She worked on a language for a page that would one day greet strangers and tell them who she was and what she offered, not with loud claims, but with honest words that felt like a handshake. Her old mentor showed up like sunlight through a cracked door. On video calls, the mentor smiled and listened, sometimes asking the one question that cracked Aisha's doubt open just enough to let courage in. "What do you want people to feel when they receive this?" the mentor would ask, and Aisha learned to answer with more than features and prices. She talked about care, about dignity, about the way something simple could carry comfort from one home to another. She refined her idea over and over, patient with herself in a way she wished someone had been patient with her years ago. She created a quiet name for her brand and wrote it on a piece of paper, then pinned it inside the wardrobe behind her clothes, where it could wait until the world was ready to see it. At night, she would open a wardrobe and look at it for a few seconds, a private ritual that steadied her breathing. Money was not abundant, so she moved carefully, buying only what she needed and saving wherever she could. She cut back on small luxuries without letting scarcity turn her mean. She sold 2 old dresses she no longer wore and a set of earrings that Daniel never noticed. With that money, she ordered her first small batch of materials. The day the package arrived, she signed for it with steady hands but felt a tremor in her chest, like the first deep drumbeat before music begins. She laid everything out on the dining table: samples, labels, tiny tools, the beginnings of what would become her livelihood, and studied them with the attention of someone welcoming guests who would change her life. She made mistakes that first week, clumsy and frustrating ones. Labels peeling, boxes mismeasured, a product that looked good in her head but fell flat in her hands. She did not cry over it. She learned, adjusted, tried again, and grew gentler with herself in the process. It wasn't all invisible. One afternoon, Imran, the friend who had tried to protect her that first night, stopped by to return a book Daniel had lent him. Daniel was out, and for a moment Aisha considered pretending she was busy and sending him away. But Imran lingered at the door with a hesitant kindness that did not feel like pity. He cleared his throat and apologized again for not speaking up more when Daniel had mocked her. She nodded, accepting his apology not because it erased what happened, but because it reached her with sincerity. Imran noticed the sample spread across the dining table and tilted his head. "Is this the business he laughed about?" he asked, half smiling. Aisha took a breath and told him yes, and in a few simple sentences, she explained what she was building. He listened without interruption, then surprised her by offering something practical. He knew a woman who ran a small community page online and often highlighted local sellers with honest stories. She doesn't promote everything, he warned gently, but when she believes in someone, she helps for real. He sent an introduction that night, without fanfare or conditions, and Aisha thanked him with gratitude that did not need big words. The first message from the community page arrived like a quiet knock. The woman asked thoughtful questions, not just about the product, but about Aisha's process, her intention, and her promise to customers. Aisha answered plainly, resisting the urge to sound bigger than she was. She took 2 careful photos in the afternoon light on the balcony and wrote a short paragraph that felt like her own voice. No borrowed phrases, no flashy promises. The post went up on a Wednesday evening, tucked between other local stories, and nothing dramatic happened at first. Then, an hour later, a new email slid into her inbox with a subject line that made her heart skip. First order. Aisha read it twice, then a third time. Her hands covered her mouth as if she needed a hold in the sound of relief. She fulfilled the order with trembling precision, checked every edge, wrapped it like a gift, and wrote a handwritten note that thanked the buyer not for saving her, but for trusting her. The second order came the next morning, and the third by nightfall. They were not hundreds. They were not even dozens. But each one arrived with the weight of a small beginning that refused to be ignored. Aisha built a tiny routine around them. Track, prepare, pack, confirm, walked to the courier with a steady step that felt like a vow in motion. She made a simple spreadsheet and updated it with quiet satisfaction. Each line another proof that her life was expanding beyond the four walls of Daniel's approval. She cleared a shelf in the closet and turned it into her own inventory corner. She gave it a small smile every time she passed, the way one smiles at a growing child who has learned a new word. There were close calls. One evening, Daniel reached for the wardrobe where she kept her pinned brand name and the stack of order slips, and her breath faltered in her throat. He was looking for a tie and did not notice the paper tucked behind her dresses, though his fingers brushed it enough to lift the corner. Aisha kept her face still, light on her feet, moving to the dresser to hand him what he wanted. He grunted a thanks and left the room, and only then did she let herself breathe again. Another afternoon, the courier arrived early while Daniel was on a work call in the living room. Aisha intercepted the doorbell with a smile that hid an entire plan, stepping outside to sign for the package before any question could rise. These moments reminded her that the foundation she was building needed a stronger roof. She could not hide forever. She did not want to. So she began to plan the unveiling not as an attack, but as a truth revealed in daylight. She timed it without rushing fate. Daniel mentioned, almost boastful, that he would be inviting the same group of friends again in a few weeks. He wanted to relive the easy power of that first evening, the way their laughter had stretched his ego like a new suit. Aisha nodded as if it meant little to her, and went back to the kitchen to stir a pot that did not need stirring. Inside, she adjusted her calendar, matched it to her supply orders, checked that her website would be ready to welcome visitors with grace, and made sure that the small stream of satisfied buyers could be gently invited to leave honest reviews. She reached out to the woman from the community page and asked, with quiet humility, whether she could share a follow-up story on the same weekend, not to praise her, but to describe the journey so far. The woman agreed, and Aisha felt the ground beneath her feet steady further, while Daniel continued to repeat his lines to anyone who would listen, that Aisha could not handle stress, that she was clumsy, that she was too soft for the world. Aisha practiced a different kind of strength. She taught herself to separate a person's volume from their value. She made peace with the fact that some people would only notice her when success made a noise they could not ignore. She learned to hold her joy quietly, to measure her progress by the sincerity of her work instead of the size of her applause. At night, while Daniel flipped through channels looking for something loud enough to drown out his own emptiness, Aisha edited a short presentation that would live on her laptop. Simple and clean, a window into what she had built without a single cruel word. No slides about revenge, no arrows pointing at him. Only the evidence of her effort and the fruits of her patience. The week before the dinner, a customer sent a message that became a keepsake. "I don't know you," it began, "but I can feel the care in this." It arrived like it mattered. Aisha read it twice, then saved it in a small folder she named Reasons. When doubt pressed its cold hand against her back, she opened that folder and let the warmth return. She was not waiting to embarrass anyone. She was waiting to stand in her own light, to make clear that her hope did not break when mocked, that it grew roots under the noise. She decided she would not raise her voice in that living room. She would press a single key, let the screen speak, and let the room discover the woman they had not seen, because they were busy looking at the man who took up all the space. On the afternoon of the gathering, the house filled with familiar sounds. Pans heating, plates stacking, Daniel's footsteps heavy with anticipation, the doorbell ringing as friends arrived with the same jokes on their tongues. Aisha welcomed them with easy grace, the practiced calm of a hostess who knows how to set a table and set a tone. She moved through the room like water, soft and unbothered, offering tea, adjusting a cushion, smiling at Imran, whose eyes met hers with quiet question and a small nod as if he sensed the current beneath the surface. Daniel began to perform again, not as vicious as before, but still careless, still eager for laughs. She let him. It cost her nothing now. Her laptop waited quietly on a sideboard, closed but ready, as patient as she had trained herself to be. And as the evening took shape around old patterns, she felt no tremble in her hands, no burn in her cheeks, only the steady certainty that this time a room would witness the truth, and when it did, no one would forget what they had seen. The evening began with the same noise and rhythm as before. Daniel's laughter echoed across the room as he welcomed his friends, clapping him on the back as if he were the king of a small kingdom. Confident that the night would again be about his stories, his voice, his presence. The dining table shimmered under the light. Every plate neatly arranged by Aisha's careful hands. Every dish prepared with the same patience she had shown before, though this time she did not feel the exhaustion of a woman taken for granted. She moved gracefully from kitchen to living room, carrying trays of food and drinks, her calm smile giving nothing away. Daniel joked again at her expense, poking fun at her quietness, remarking that she didn't have much to say because she didn't know much. His friends laughed out of habit, though not all of them fully believed it anymore. Imran especially shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to Aisha with respect that Daniel could not see. And Aisha, instead of flinching or shrinking, carried herself with a steadiness that filled the air with something Daniel was too arrogant to notice, a calm before the storm. As the evening went on, Daniel grew more relaxed, his laughter louder, his arrogance unchecked. He leaned back in his chair with glass in hand, mocking a story about how Aisha once got lost driving to a nearby market, stretching the tale until it sounded absurd. He spoke as if she were invisible, a convenient character in his performance. The room chuckled politely, but there was a different energy now, an undercurrent that none of them could fully place. Aisha waited until the food was served, until the plates were half empty and the wine glasses nearly drained, until Daniel was most comfortable in his false sense of power. Then, when his voice carried across the room with another dismissive laugh, she moved to the sideboard, picked up her laptop, and placed it gently on the coffee table in front of everyone. The shift in the room was immediate. The laughter dimmed, the clinking of glasses quieted, and Daniel blinked at her as though she had broken some unwritten rule. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice half amused, half irritated, as if she were interrupting his stage. But Aisha did not answer him directly. She opened the laptop, her fingers steady, and connected it to the television with a calm precision that startled even herself. The screen lit up, replacing the glow of the candles with something brighter, something undeniable. At first, it was a simple logo, clean and elegant, her chosen brand name displayed in colors that spoke of dignity and warmth. Then, images appeared, photographs of her products carefully arranged, snapshots of satisfied customers holding packages, screenshots of reviews filled with gratitude and praise. The words glowed on the screen, beautifully made, arrived with so much care. You can feel the effort in every detail. The room fell silent as her story unfolded in slides and photos, each one revealing the journey she had built in the shadows of his arrogance. Daniel's smirk faltered. He shifted in his seat, trying to dismiss it with a laugh. "What is this?" "Some kind of hobby," he said, his voice loud, but the lack of laughter from his friends made his words sound hollow. They were not laughing now. They were leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the screen, on the evidence of Aisha's dedication, on the reality that stood in stark contrast to the picture Daniel had painted of her. Imran smiled faintly, proud and unsurprised, while another friend muttered under his breath, "This is impressive." Aisha spoke then, her voice calm, clear, and steady. She explained how she had started, how she had built everything step by step, how each order had taught her something new, and how she had grown stronger with every challenge. She did not raise her voice, did not look at Daniel for approval or reaction. She spoke as if he were just another guest in the room, as if the story belonged only to her and the people who believed in it. By the time the final slide appeared, showing a growing number of followers and customers waiting for her next launch, the room was completely silent. Daniel sat stiff, his pride cracked and crumbling under the weight of what he could no longer deny. His friends clapped, not out of politeness, but with genuine admiration, the sound of their applause filling the very space where they had once laughed at her humiliation. One of them even said, "Aisha, this is incredible. You've built something real." Daniel's face turned pale, his usual confidence gone, as he realized that the woman he had mocked so freely had risen in front of his friends, her dignity shining brighter than any story he could tell. Aisha closed the laptop slowly, her expression calm and her smile polite. She did not gloat, did not throw his cruelty back in his face. She simply thanked everyone for listening and excused herself, leaving the men in stunned silence. The air in the room felt different now. The balance had shifted. The same friends who had once laughed with Daniel were now questioning him with their eyes, wondering how he could have failed to see the strength in the woman beside him. And as Daniel sat there, speechless for the first time in memory, he understood something he had never considered before, that the person he thought he had silenced had been speaking all along, just in a language he could not control. The silence that followed Aisha's quiet exit from the living room was heavier than any words Daniel could have spoken. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes lingering not on him, but on the empty space she left behind, as though the air itself still carried her presence. For years, Daniel had been the center of every gathering, the loudest laugh, the sharpest voice, the one who filled the room with stories that often came at her expense. But tonight the balance had shifted, and it was his wife's calm strength that had taken root in their minds. Imran broke the silence first, his tone measured but laced with meaning. "She's done something remarkable, Daniel. You should be proud." The words, though kindly meant, struck Daniel like a slap. Proud? How could he be proud when everything he had mocked had turned into the very thing that humbled him in front of the men he valued most? He forced a chuckle, waved his hand as though it were nothing, but the sound was hollow, and everyone in the room heard it for what it was: defense, not truth. As the evening drew to an awkward close, the friends left one by one, their laughter muted, their glances sharper than before. They shook Daniel's hand politely, but their admiration followed Aisha instead, even in her absence. One lingered at the door and said softly, "She's stronger than you realize," before stepping out into the night. Daniel stood frozen, his hand on the doorknob, his chest tightening with a discomfort he could not name. He had always believed he controlled the story of their marriage, that his words shaped how others saw her, but now he realized his control was an illusion. She had rewritten the script without him, and the world had chosen to believe her truth. When he finally walked into the bedroom, Aisha was already lying in bed, her face calm, her breathing steady. She did not turn when he entered, did not rush to explain herself, did not seek his approval. For the first time in their marriage, Daniel was the one standing uncertain in the doorway, searching for words that refused to come. He wanted to confront her, to demand why she embarrassed him, but the image of her presentation flashed in his mind. The growing orders, the glowing reviews, the applause of his friends, and the accusations died before they could form. He lay beside her in silence, but sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing tall in front of his friends, her voice clear, her dignity untouchable. The following days were strangely quiet. Daniel moved through the house with a stiffness that betrayed his unease. He wanted to regain his dominance, to mock her as he always had, but the words stuck in his throat. Every insult he considered felt weak against the evidence of her strength. The friends he once entertained with stories about her no longer laughed the same way when he called. Some even asked about her instead, curious about her business, offering small words of support that made Daniel's pride burn hotter. He realized with a bitterness that tasted sharp on his tongue that the respect he once commanded was slipping away, not because anyone had taken it from him, but because his wife had earned it by being everything he had claimed she could never be. Aisha, meanwhile, did not change her rhythm. She continued her work with the same quiet determination, fulfilling orders, sending packages, answering customer questions with kindness. She did not gloat, did not throw his humiliation back at him. She treated him with the same politeness she always had, though there was something new in her demeanor, a distance, a self-possession that told him she no longer needed his permission to exist. She moved around the house like someone who had discovered her own center of gravity, untouchable by the small storms he tried to summon. For the first time, Daniel saw what it meant for silence to be power, for dignity to be sharper than any insult. Weeks passed, and Daniel's friends began to speak of her with admiration when they gathered, their conversations peppered with questions about her growing success. Daniel sat among them, his forced smiles cracking under the weight of their respect for her. He could no longer tell the stories he once relied on, because now they rang false, exposed by her truth. One evening, Imran looked at him directly and said, "You should be careful, Daniel. Not every man gets a wife like her. Most of us can only hope to find someone with that kind of strength. The words settled into Daniel's chest like stones, heavy and inescapable. He realized, perhaps too late, that the laughter he had once enjoyed at her expense had cost him something greater. The quiet, unwavering loyalty of the woman he had taken for granted. One night, as they sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, Daniel finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost uncertain. You didn't have to do that in front of them. Aisha looked up from the notebook in her lap, her eyes calm, her face unreadable. She studied him for a long moment before replying, her words slow and measured. I didn't do it for them. I did it for me. There was no anger in her tone, no cruelty, only a clarity that cut deeper than rage ever could. Daniel opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but none came. For the first time, he understood that he was no longer the center of her world, that she had built a life that could exist with or without him. The realization gnawed at him in the days that followed. He saw her differently now. Not as a woman he had once mocked, but as someone who carried a strength he had never bothered to recognize. His pride wanted to resist, to pull her back into the shadow where he had kept her. But his heart, though too proud to admit it, knew that shadow no longer existed. Aisha had stepped into her own light, and the memory of that moment, her standing before his friends with quiet grace, will haunt him every time he tried to dismiss her. Her revenge had not been loud, nor cruel, nor petty. It had been patient, graceful, and undeniable. And because of that, it left a scar deeper than any harsh words could have. Daniel knew he would never forget the night his wife showed him, and everyone else, that strength needs no permission, that dignity speaks louder than mockery, and that silence, when chosen wisely, can become the most unforgettable response of all.